So last night we had the primary election for Utah's 2nd congressional district, which is having a special election this November to fill the seat of Chris Stewart, who, of course, announced he would be leaving Congress. So this leaves, of course, an open seat, and of course, this is an open primary. And as of right now, with 80% of the vote in, we have Celeste Malloy leading the pack with 38%, and then Becky Edwards at 36%. And we're going to talk mainly about Becky Edwards because she's a candidate I think is pretty interesting. And she's somebody that in normal circumstances would have no chance in a Republican primary. So we're going to talk about who Becky Edwards is, what her positions are, and ultimately speculate on the outcome of this special primary race, which will probably be announced in the coming days. So we're going to get to all of that in just a second. But first, if you're new to the channel, please consider subscribing down below and liking this video if you enjoy. So Becky Edwards is a very interesting Republican, if you can call her that. She is somebody who voted for Joe Biden back in 2020. She's somebody who's pro-choice, pro-gun control, pro-climate change. You know, she holds all of these very Democratic positions, but yet decides to run as a Republican in a very deep red district. And there's a major reason for this. In the state of Utah, you do have some more moderate Republicans, some of the more Romney-esque, fiscally responsible type Republicans in more of the urban centers like Salt Lake City. Again, this is a very Mormon state. It's the most Mormon state by far in the country. So you do have some of those intrinsic, socially conservative family sort of values, which is why the Republican Party probably does so well in this state. But, you know, as of recently, we've seen a massive lurch to the left in places like Salt Lake City and really the northern part of the state of Utah in general. Now, part of this is because of population growth from other states, but part of it's also because Utah has an extremely young population. A lot of these Mormons have many kids, and of course, these kids tend to be much more liberal than their parents. But the main reason why Becky Edwards is polling so competitively and why she may potentially win this primary in, again, a very safe red district in a very safe red state is because Utah has open primaries. So essentially, if you're a Democrat in Utah, you're going to vote in the Republican primary because the Democrat really doesn't have any chance in the general election. And Utah is one of the red states that I think has really mastered this. You know, the Democrats in Utah have really mastered this strategy to sort of put forward a number of Republicans that are probably the most centrist, moderate Republicans you're going to get in a very safe red state. Again, Utah Republicans are a bit of a different breed. You know, overall, they're not really fans of, you know, Trump, things like that. So they are a bit more moderate. And they do care a lot about presenting a more friendly branding of politics. You know, Mitt Romney is somebody who really embodies, I think, a lot of the Utah GOP. So really, for somebody like Becky Edwards to have a chance in this red district, in this red state, she would have to run as a Republican and get independent and Democratic votes. And that's basically what her campaign has been about. You know, she's somebody who really doesn't hide a lot of her more liberal views. Again, she supported the impeachment of Donald Trump. She voted for Joe Biden in 2020. She's pro-gun control. She opposed the overturning of Roe v. Wade. So, you know, on its face, when you look at those positions by themselves, you would think Becky Edwards was a liberal Democrat, but she's really somebody just masquerading as a Republican running in this district. And like we said, she could very well win. So, you know, it is really interesting because this is sort of a Utah phenomenon. Again, this isn't the first time Democrats have voted in Republican primaries to try and get their preferred candidate. If you remember back last year, Liz Cheney's primary had essentially all Democratic support. Nearly all the Republicans voted for her opponents. And you could really see that evidently by the amount of people that voted in the Democratic primary. I think it was only like 6,000, or it was an extremely tiny number. Even for the state of Wyoming, which doesn't really have a whole lot of Democrats, that's an incredibly low number. So, you know, in some of these deep red states, you do have Democrats sort of using this strategy to get sort of the candidate that will do the least damage to their positions. And Becky Edwards would certainly be their golden child because she essentially doesn't really hide any of her more liberal positions. I guess the only thing she'd really be conservative on is probably the more economic issues, the budget, things like that. She'll probably vote in line with Republicans. But even among the more moderate House members, in the Republican caucus, people like Brian Fitzpatrick, Tony Gonzalez, I think even somebody like Becky Edwards would feel a bit out of place since she's so far out of the Republican field in terms of many of her viewpoints. But, you know, this isn't the first time this has happened in Utah. And if you look at the Utah Republican delegation, many of these Republicans are on the more moderate side or even on the more liberal side. You know, a prime example of that is Utah's Governor Spencer Cox, who is very socially progressive, except on the issue of abortion. But when it comes to gender issues and things like that, he's very much in line with the Democratic viewpoint, which sort of puts him out of step with Utah Republicans by and large. So, you do have other Republicans like this cropping up in Utah, and it's not necessarily because the Republican base in Utah is so liberal. We can actually take a look at the Utah convention results to sort of debunk that a bit. But it's really because you have so many moderates, independents, and Democrats that just vote in Republican primaries. So all you need is really 15 to 20% of the more liberal Republicans to vote for these candidates, and then all the independents and most of the Democrats too. And there you have it. You have a much more liberal Republican representing your state. If we take a look at the special election convention, which I really don't know why Utah even has conventions, considering the fact that they don't mean anything. They're completely non-binding. I mean, if the convention was binding, Becky Edwards would have been eliminated by the third ballot. And if you take a look at her total, she only got 5% of the convention vote on the first ballot. So only 5% of these Republicans supported Becky Edwards. Yet if you take a look at the primary, she's at 36% of the vote. And again, that's 5% of a convention. That's not even representative of the Republican base. So what I'm trying to say is Becky Edwards has literally no support within the Republican Party, but because you allow people like independents and Democrats to vote in Republican primaries, you get somebody like Becky Edwards potentially being the nominee. So, of course, my advice to Utah Republicans is to close your primaries. I don't know how they would do that. I don't know why this wasn't considered before, but this is obviously a major problem. And I guess I could already answer that question because I think a lot of the Republicans in the Utah state legislature probably benefited from courting independent and Democratic votes to win their primaries. So that's probably why you won't see this closed anytime soon. But of course, if I was a Utah Republican, I'd be advocating very forcefully to get the primaries closed because you're going to have a much better quality in the representatives you get from a Republican standpoint than you will if you basically let the general electorate also mingle in with the Republican primaries. Another reason why Becky Edwards is potentially on track to win, and we'll talk about the numbers in some of these counties. It really is still up in the air. Many people are putting this as a toss-up. Some people have said Malloy is very slightly favored, so it really is a very volatile race. Anybody could really take this. But another reason why Becky Edwards could win is because of the vote split. I don't know why the conservative Republicans in Utah didn't coalesce around one candidate, but Becky Edwards only has 36% of the vote right now. If this was a two-person race, it would be 64-36. Becky Edwards would be losing in a landslide in this primary, but of course, that's not what happened. The Republican field sort of splintered between the more MAGA candidate, Bruce Howe, and then sort of the more establishment moderate Republican in Celeste Malloy. And I wouldn't even call Becky Edwards a moderate Republican. I'd just call her basically a Democrat and everything but name, because Celeste Malloy is more of an accurate representation of what a moderate to standard, I guess, Republican would sort of be like. Now, this isn't Becky Edwards' first crack at elected office, at least statewide in Utah. If we go back to 2022, she was one of the main primary opponents of Mike Lee, and she was basically running an unapologetically liberal campaign against Mike Lee. Basically, her entire attack line was that Mike Lee was a Trump puppet, that he voted to end democracy, all of these things. So Becky Edwards was basically running the standard resist lib campaign in Utah. And again, the reason why she probably felt comfortable in doing this was because she thought she could get enough independents and even sort of moderate-leaning Republicans as well as Democrats to vote in the Utah primary. And if we take a look at some of the urban areas, you can really see this effect in action. Becky Edwards getting 41% of the vote in Salt Lake City. There's no way 41% of Utah Republicans would vote for somebody like Becky Edwards. That's because they didn't. A lot of these voters are independents and Democrats, so on and so forth. And you can even see when some of the rural areas that Becky Edwards' support basically collapses into the teens and low 20s. That's because you really don't have a lot of Democrats and independent voters in these counties. It's basically completely solid red in a lot of these areas. But in the urban centers around Salt Lake City, she does have much stronger support, and that's because, again, there's just more Democrats there. Another example of this effect in Utah, of course, is the Senate election that followed that primary with Evan McMullin and Mike Lee. In this general election, you basically had all of the Democrats, a large chunk of independents, and like 15% of Republicans voting for Evan McMullin. That's one of the reasons why he did so well compared to even just your standard Democrat. A standard Democrat in Utah probably gets in the mid-30s in races like this, but because you had somebody like Evan McMullin who at least was pretending to be a bit more on the conservative side to try and peel away some Republican vote, he actually got this race within about 10 points. In Salt Lake City, he won by around 19 points. Summit County, Grand County won pretty comfortably. Even in Provo, 35% is an incredibly high number for anybody who's not a Republican. That's because he sort of tried to cobble together this sort of coalition. So really the winning strategy for non-Republicans in Utah is this. It's to get all the Democrats to vote for you, the large majority of independents to vote for you, and then, of course, get a chunk of Republicans. And that's basically the strategy that Becky Edwards and Evan McMullin have tried using. Now, because Utah is such a red state, it has failed on the statewide level for the most part, I'd say, barring maybe Spencer Cox, but of course that was a primary election that's a bit different than the general election. But as for Becky Edwards and her chances in the second, so far we still don't have any updates in the vote. We'll probably get the results in the next couple of days since, I guess they're counting the mail-ins, or I don't really know how Utah's electoral system works very well. I'm guessing the in-person vote's already counted. It's just the mail-ins now that are sort of being processed. But if we take a look at Salt Lake County, we have 77% of the vote in. Becky Edwards is at 61%. Bruce Howell is at 20%. So she has a 40-plus point lead there. So obviously the rest of the votes coming in from Salt Lake County are likely to favor her. Same thing with Davis County. She's up by 19 points, 82% of the vote. Again, the raw vote margin that she's probably going to increase isn't going to be that much. But again, it's going to add up when you factor in, of course, Salt Lake County and some of these other counties. Now, the rest of the counties on this map in the district, the southern part of the district, are very conservative. They have pretty large margins for Celeste Malloy, but obviously this would be much easier for her if she had Bruce Howe supporters as well. And the good thing for Utah Republicans is that Bruce Howe has basically collapsed in these southern counties. He's really not doing that well, and that's of course good for Utah Republicans because they'd much rather have Celeste Malloy as their representative than, of course, Becky Edwards. And of course, if Becky Edwards goes up against a Democrat in the general, that would be a pretty interesting dynamic because I wonder what kind of campaign she would decide to run. I think she'd probably, based on her previous performances, still run as this, sort of resist lib Republican, which of course would make a lot of Republicans very angry. So, again, she only has 36% of the primary vote, but because you have 3 candidates in the race, that is enough to win if she does increase that number a bit if Celeste Malloy drops. Something that could solve a little thing like this is ranked choice voting in primaries, which is a very interesting proposal and maybe something we'll make a video about because I'm not really somebody who's a fan of ranked choice voting overall, but potentially in instances like this in primaries where you can sort of weed out candidates that really aren't representative of the party's values or the party's voters, it is something that could be considered by Republicans, I think, on a primary level, because then you sort of eliminate this problem altogether. But anyway, this race is really a toss-up. We'll probably get the result in the next coming days. But again, it's really interesting that you could have somebody like Becky Edwards, somebody who's so openly liberal in a safe red district, almost win a Republican primary because of the fact that Utah has these open primaries and you have these slightly more moderate Republicans. So this was really to dispel the myth that, Utah Republicans are somehow extremely left-wing compared to Republicans in other states. They are a bit more moderate, but the main reason why Becky Edwards is doing so well in this primary is because independents and Democrats are supporting her, and that's really the main reason why this is so close. Anyway, that's it for today's video. Please leave a thumbs up if you enjoyed, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell notification so you don't miss any more videos I put out. As always, again, thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.